Before crosses lined the skyline, before pulpits thundered with the promise of heaven or the terror of hell, there were other courts, sacred, ancient, divine. In the heart of the forest, beneath baobab trees and moonlit skies, our ancestors stood before gods who knew their names. Not the silent, distant judges of faraway lands, but gods who walked with them, gods who ate with them, gods who listened to the soul's last breath. These were the divine courts of Africa. Older than empires, deeper than memory. Here justice was not punishment, it was balance. Here the soul was not sentenced to eternal flames. It was weighed, questioned, remembered. From the sands of Kemet, where Maat's feather floated beside the heart, to the rivers of the Yoruba, where Olodumare's gaze saw beyond death, to the red soil of the Igbo, where ancestors judged not by words, but by the life you lived. This is not just a story of the afterlife. It is a story of how Africa remembered justice, how Africa honored truth, how Africa judged the soul, long before the cross, long before the missionary came. So today, we open the gates of memory, we step back into the sacred courtroom, and we ask, how did the gods of our ancestors measure a man's worth? Welcome to the divine courts. In many African cultures, death is not regarded as an eternal end, but rather as a passage into another realm where the living and the spiritual coexist in layered harmony. Life and death are seen as two overlapping stages of the same journey, one of transformation rather than termination. Across West, Central, East, and Southern Africa, beliefs in dual existence are shared. Physical life unfolds in visible space, homes, towns, villages, while the spiritual realm persists in invisible dimensions, accessible through ritual, dream, and symbolic portals. Trees, rivers, ancestral groves, and sacred lands are not mere backdrops to daily life, but thresholds where the veil between worlds thins and where ancestors continue to walk among their descendants, shaping fate, well-being, and the moral arcs of communities. Central to this cosmology is the belief in the soul as an eternal entity that journeys across realms. Whether called Ka in ancient Egypt, Chi among the Igbo and other Nigerians, Kra in Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, or Ori among the Yoruba, the soul is not a transient spark, but a conscious presence with purpose. It embodies destiny and spiritual identity. Through funeral rites, songs, and communal remembrance at burial sites, elders guide each soul back toward ancestral integration. Yet this transition is not a one-time event, but part of a cyclical flow. Souls may rest among ancestors, return to testify in dreams, or even reincarnate within a family line, depending on their spiritual alignment and the rituals performed for them. Portals such as rivers, ancient trees, or sacred groves serve as conduits between these realms. Yoruba shrines placed beside rivers honor deities who guide souls and maintain cosmic balance. Ghanaian baobab trees shield Nsamanfo gatherings, where ancestral spirits convene during annual festivals. These natural sites are neither random nor decorative. They are spiritual architecture. Rituals performed at these portals, libations, drumming, storytelling, activate the continuities that bind living families to departed elders. This practice anchors community life within a sacred ecological cycle, weaving ancestors, land, and morality into daily rhythms. In these systems, the afterlife is not administered by distant judges who decree eternal reward or punishment. Instead, cosmic judgment is relational, communal, and restorative. Souls are assessed not for their conformity to external doctrines, but for their alignment with cosmic harmony, ancestral covenant, and destiny. Embedded in these traditions is a profound understanding. Spiritual justice is not binary doom, but rather the restoration of balance between living and dead, earth and sky, individual and community. Rather than condemnation, the divine orders offer return, renewal, and ancestral integration. In this vibrant spiritual cosmos, life and death dance in a shared breath, bound by ritual, memory, and cosmic purpose. African spiritual traditions, the soul's journey after death was overseen not by vengeful gods, but by sacred councils devoted to justice, harmony, and truth. Among the Yoruba, belief centers on two possible destinations: Orunrere, the realm of well-intentioned souls, and Orunapadi, for those whose lives were marked by imbalance or neglect. Regardless of where one went, before reaching their destination, the soul passed before Olodumare, the supreme creator, and a host of Orisha who affirmed whether a life had honored its divine oath. This was not eternal punishment, but an assessment of alignment with cosmic intention, an act of moral refinement guided by ancestral wisdom rather than condemnation. Further west, among the Akan of modern-day Ghana, the invisible domain of the Nsimanfo, ancestral spirits, worked alongside the Abosom, lesser deities associated with rivers, forests, and moral law, to evaluate a soul's deeds. In this spiritual courtroom, each action, whether rooted in generosity, respect for elders, or ecological care, was weighed not for reward or punishment, but for communal resonance and ancestral approval. The judges were not distant arbiters, they were family and lineage, smiling or frowning based on how fully one had honored duty and destiny. Judgment here was not fear-inducing, but relational, woven into daily practice, rather than reserved for the afterlife. Among the Igbo people, a closely related belief held that upon death, a soul's journey included review by the ancestors to determine its readiness for reincarnation. This process, known as Ikwa Ozu, assessed whether the soul had fulfilled its purpose or required another life cycle to come into balance. A soul could return to guide its own family again, or be asked to remain among the ancestors until its destiny was realigned. This cyclical view underscored the principle that spiritual evolution was gradual and communal. Even in rest, the cycle of accountability continued, not as eternal sentencing, but as measured adjustment within a cosmic rhythm. Further north, the ancient Egyptians, whose spiritual legacy endures in our collective imagination, depicted the deceased standing before Osiris with a heart placed on a scale opposite the feather of Ma'at, goddess of truth and order. If the heart balanced, the soul was guided onward toward spiritual perfection. If not, it was devoured. Yet even this dramatic imagery embodies balance more than fear. Spiritual justice here was symbolic of ethical living, and Ma'at's scale represented cosmic restoration, not arbitrary prejudice. The heart was weighed not to punish, but to integrate the soul into continuing cosmic harmony. Despite appearing distinct, these spiritual judiciary systems share a core emphasis. Divine justice in Africa was always relational, upholding ancestral covenant, moral coherence, and cosmic balance, not binary salvation or damnation. Judgment was an act of recalibration rather than retribution, a return to duty rather than a descent into torment. This idea remains deeply rooted in oral histories and sacred memory, defying the assumption that ancient justice demanded eternal fear. Instead, it offered eternal equilibrium, both a promise and a path back into cosmic accord. Divine courts measured souls not by creed or ceremony, but by the resonance of intention with cosmic and communal values. Living in truth stood at the heart of this judgment, rooted deep in integrity and aligned speech. Words carried weight. Lies were seen as fractures in moral fabric, disruptive not just to individuals, but to the webs of trust binding families, communities, and ancestors. Honoring community and ancestors was more than ceremony. It was an active commitment to legacy. Elders, kin, and ancestors formed a continuous chain of responsibility. To neglect rights, promises, or respect was to unravel collective harmony, inviting spiritual imbalance not only in death, but in everyday lived reality. Vital too was the notion of destiny, whether called Ori by the Yoruba, Chi by the Igbo, or Kra among the Akan. These spiritual energies weren't vague abstractions, they were the primordial blueprint of one's purpose in the world. Destiny could be honored or withheld through choices. A soul aligned with its Ori, Chi, or Kra lived in rhythm with personal mission and cosmic pattern. When destiny was ignored, out of ignorance, greed, or coercion, it created spiritual stagnation. That stagnation traveled like a gravity well, pulling communities and future generations into discord. Taboos and virtues carried spiritual consequences. Taboos against specific acts or utterances were protective cords woven into the spiritual grid. Violating them corrupted the individual and threatened clan welfare. Virtues, conversely, served as beacons. Generosity, reciprocity, humility, truth, respect for elders, balance with nature. Each virtue acted as a protective spiritual code, channeling positive energy across generations. These moral codes were not optional guidelines but spiritual geology. When ancestors found moral transgressions, the ripple traveled into the courtroom of divine justice. Diviners, priests, and mediums functioned as spiritual diagnosticians and healers. They used divination tools, such as Ifa palm nuts, Ikenga statues, or Nankisi charms, to detect and interpret unseen fractures in individual or communal moral bonds. Rituals followed: cleansing baths, libations poured to ancestors, communal prayers at sacred rivers, or processional dramas retelling cosmic myths. These ceremonies were not symbolic, they were judicial proceedings under divine review. When imbalance was restored through ritual repentance, truth affirmed, and communal respect re-established, spiritual healing radiated outward. The world was rebalanced. Over time, participation in these moral archives became integrated into everyday living. When someone gave water to a traveler, they honored lineage. When an elder was honored in speech, community bonds were strengthened. When sacred trees were protected, ecological justice was enacted. By aligning destiny and moral code, daily life constituted practice for cosmic accountability. The divine courts were not reserved for myth, but lived in each act of truth, each moment of remembrance, each ritual of righting wrongdoing. Judgment, then, was not punitive, it was restorative. It healed precisely because it upheld cosmic integrity, acknowledging that a world grounded in relational ethics reflects divine justice by living it. In African spiritual cosmology, the divine courts were presided over by a caste of cosmic figures who served as judges, witnesses, and at times executors of spiritual law. In ancient Egypt, Ma'at, the goddess of truth, balance, and cosmic order, oversaw the weighing of hearts against her feather, ensuring that justice was aligned with moral harmony. Among the Yoruba, the supreme creator Olodumare convened with Orisha such as Obatala, guardian of sacred destiny and human form, and Esu, the divine messenger and arbiter of moral openings. These divine entities weighed intentions, deeds, and destinies with impartiality, ensuring that cosmic design was honored. In Igbo traditions, Allah, the earth goddess, upheld the purity of the land and the covenant of moral law. Any transgressor of taboo risked spiritual retribution, manifesting as illness or misfortune. Amadioha, the god of lightning and justice, symbolized swift moral judgment when social balance was threatened. Among the Akan and Ashanti, Niame, the supreme sky god, was supported by Abasam, the rightful executioners of moral verdicts tied to natural forces and communal ethics. These divine entities did not operate in a vacuum. They were deeply relational, bound to the moral framework of kinship, community, and environment. Ancestors served as courtroom witnesses, guardians of lineage memory, and validators of moral testimony. Their silent presence weighed heavily in verdicts, ensuring that family oaths, ancestral rituals, and generational promises were honored. Spirits such as Shango, Yoruba Orisha of thunder and justice, and Ekwensu, Igbo spirit of chaotic balance, acted as executioners when cosmic truth was violated. Storms, lightning, or misfortune could serve as divine release, purging imbalance with natural force. These expressions were not random calamities, but deliberate signals from the courts of spirit. Divine decisions also manifested through dreams, visions, illness, and natural events. A recurring dream of a deceased elder might signal ancestral disapproval. A sudden fever could indicate impurity in relational speech. An unseasonal thunderstorm might warn of moral disruption in the community. In these ways, divine justice was activated, not by distant judgment, but by everyday signs woven into the lived world. Each deity, each ancestral witness, and each natural verdict composed a living judicial ecosystem that held individuals and communities accountable to cosmic laws. The divine courts did not exist in myth. They played out in the whisper of wind, the cry of thunder, the fevered body, and in dreams that opened the soul to alignment. This was justice enacted, not preached, a return to spiritual order under the watchful gaze of gods, ancestors, and elemental forces. After judgment within the sacred frameworks of African cosmology, the soul of the departed faces one of three profound destinies, each rooted in the moral quality of their lived experience, their relationship to the ancestral line, and the spiritual balance they maintained or disrupted during their time on Earth. The most celebrated and desired outcome is reincarnation into the family or clan. In many traditions, such as among the Yoruba, Igbo, Akan, and others, it is believed that souls can return to their lineage in a new physical form to continue their journey, fulfill unfinished destiny, or bring ancestral blessings to a new generation. This reincarnation is not random, it is intentional and sacred. Often, divination is used after the birth of a child to determine if an ancestor has returned, guiding the naming and spiritual role of that child. The family recognizes the continuity of spirit through this rebirth, affirming that death is not an end, but a sacred turning of the cosmic wheel. The second possible fate is that of peaceful rest among the ancestors. A soul who has lived a life of moral integrity, fulfilled their spiritual contract, honored elders, upheld communal responsibilities, and died with proper rites is believed to ascend into the ancestral realm. There, the soul joins the ranks of revered forebears, gaining the status of a spiritual elder. These ancestors are not passive spirits. They actively guide the living, offer protection, and maintain the moral and spiritual fabric of the family. Their names are spoken at rituals. Their wisdom is invoked in ceremonies, and their presence is welcomed during festivals and sacred observances. For many African communities, to rest among the ancestors is not only an honor, but also a confirmation that one's life was in harmony with divine law. The third and most feared outcome is rejection or wandering due to unresolved life paths. A soul that died in spiritual disalignment, having violated taboos, ignored divine instruction, betrayed kin, or refused to honor ancestral covenants, may not be granted peace or return. Instead, such a soul becomes restless, wandering between realms, causing disturbance to the living and existing in a state of limbo. These spirits are sometimes referred to as lost souls or disgraced ancestors. The most tragic fate is to be forgotten entirely, to die without burial rites, to have one's name never spoken, and to be severed from the spiritual memory of the community. This rejection severs the soul from both reincarnation and ancestral rest, rendering it a cautionary tale for the living and a source of misfortune if left unaddressed. Burial rituals and ancestral veneration play a central role in shaping these outcomes. A well-prepared burial, complete with libations, songs, communal offerings, and symbolic rites, helps guide the soul safely into the realm of ancestors. Such rituals not only honor the dead, but also cleanse the living, ensuring that the transition between realms is smooth and sacred. Ancestral veneration, through shrines, storytelling, festivals, and daily prayers, keeps the memory of the departed alive, anchoring them in the communal consciousness and preventing spiritual isolation. Without these rites, the soul risks becoming lost, forgotten, or spiritually untethered. Thus, the fates of reincarnation, rest, or rejection are not merely matters of the afterlife, but reflections of how life was lived, how death was honored, and how memory is sustained across generations. The divine courts do not simply judge. They redirect souls into the rhythm of eternity, either returning, resting, or reminding us what happens when sacred balance is broken. The arrival of Christianity, followed by colonial missionary campaigns, marked a profound disruption in the sacred systems of African divine justice. With the imposition of foreign ideologies came a systematic effort to displace and discredit indigenous spiritual structures that had guided African societies for thousands of years. The sacred courts, places where souls were weighed not by fear of damnation but by alignment with ancestral truth and cosmic law, were declared blasphemous. The gods who once sat as judges in these divine courts, the spirits who communicated through dreams, possession, and oracles, were rebranded as pagan, demonic, or superstitious. What was once a sacred and dignified spiritual architecture became, in the eyes of missionaries, a battleground for religious conquest. Shrines that had stood for generations, filled with ancestral artifacts and spiritually charged relics, were burned or dismantled. Sacred groves and altars were cleared to make space for churches. Oracles, who once served as the moral and spiritual compasses of entire communities, were labeled witches, sorcerers, or madmen, and often persecuted into silence or exile. Rituals that had connected the living to the ancestral courts, libations, divinations, trance dances, funerary rites, were outlawed, mocked, or criminalized. The spiritual codes written not in books but in rituals, names, and nature were deemed heretical by foreign theologies that insisted on binary judgment, salvation or damnation, heaven or hell, good or evil. This erasure was not merely religious. It was psychological warfare that sought to sever entire cultures from their ancestral memory and replace sacred knowledge with imported dogma. The community-based nature of African spiritual justice, which had centered collective harmony and moral accountability, was fractured. In its place arose a model of judgment external to the people, mediated through foreign scriptures and institutions. The divine courts were no longer summoned in dreams or beneath sacred trees. They were pushed underground, their presence surviving only in whispers and shadows. Yet, despite this calculated suppression, the echoes of divine justice remained resilient. In family rituals held quietly behind closed doors, in proverbs passed from grandmother to child, in the dreams where ancestors still appeared with warnings or blessings, and in the silent reverence for sacred rivers and old trees, the ancestral codes endured. African spirituality, though bruised, refused to die. It lived on in the cultural DNA of a people who remembered, even when they were not allowed to speak it aloud. The divine courts may have been denied the sunlight, but they continued to judge, to heal, and to wait beneath the surface, ready to rise again when the time came for remembering. In this present era, a quiet but powerful return is unfolding. A return of the forgotten courts. Across the African continent and throughout the diaspora, African traditional religions are rising from beneath the ashes of colonial erasure, reclaiming their sacred space in both spiritual practice and cultural identity. No longer confined to secrecy or shame, the divine courts are being reconstituted by elders, priests, priestesses, scholars, and spiritual seekers who recognize that ancestral justice is not only sacred, it is necessary. This revival is not about turning away from modernity, but about restoring cosmic balance, where spiritual accountability and ancestral wisdom are reinstalled as the compass guiding both personal integrity and communal harmony. Priests of Ifa gather once again under the Opon Ifa, interpreting the wisdom of Orunmila to bring clarity and healing to those who seek it. Vodou ceremonies in Haiti invoke the Loa to guide, judge, and affirm the paths of their children, echoing ancient West African verdicts rendered through rhythm and spirit possession. In Brazil, the practitioners of Candomblé open the doors of Orixá temples, where divine counsel is not theory but lived experience, flowing through song, dance, and oracle. These systems do not judge with damnation, but with understanding. They measure the alignment between a person and their destiny, the echo between one's actions and ancestral contract. The courts have returned not with swords, but with mirrors, reflecting back to each person the truth of who they are, who they could be, and what must be healed for them to walk in balance again. Among the youth in cities like Lagos, Accra, New York, and Port-au-Prince, there is a growing hunger for ancestral meaning, a turning away from inherited shame and toward cultural restoration. Scholars and spiritual historians document and preserve rites once nearly lost. Healers integrate ancient divination with modern therapy. Sacred justice, once feared, demonized, or forgotten, is being reimagined as the foundation for ethical living and spiritual maturity. In this moment of reawakening, judgment is not about punishment, it is about purification. It is the soul meeting its own reflection, guided by the voices of those who came before. It is justice that heals rather than harms, justice that knows your name, your lineage, and your divine purpose. The return of the divine courts signals more than a religious revival. It is the spiritual reparation of a people who now remember that the gods never left. They were waiting. And now, in the dance of ceremony and the silence of deep prayer, they judge once more, not to destroy, but to restore. Let us now close where all sacred paths converge, at the feet of the divine courts, beneath the gaze of gods, ancestors, and the timeless watchers who hold our memory in their silent hands. A hush falls as the voice returns, not as a whisper, but as a blessing. Let us walk justly, so when we stand before the ancient ones, our story is one worth remembering. These are not merely words, but a vow, a promise to carry ourselves with the weight of ancestral wisdom, with the dignity of those who know the gods are not distant, but near, and always watching. We offer our deepest thanks to Olodumare, to Ma'at, to Allah and Amadioha, to Shango, to the Orisha and Abosom, to the keepers of the sacred groves, and the whisperers of dreams. We bow to the ancestors whose names live in our bones, whose stories pulse in our blood. We acknowledge the spirits of the land, the rivers, the winds, and the fire, the witnesses who were never silenced, only waiting to be heard again. To those who walked this journey with us, we thank you. You are not just viewers, you are part of the restoration. You have entered the courtroom of the gods, not as strangers, but as kin, reclaiming what was never truly lost. If this journey stirred your spirit, let it continue. Leave a comment below sharing the name of a deity, ancestor, or tradition that called to you. Let the divine hear you speak it aloud. Subscribe to this space so we can walk further together into the memory of our sacred inheritance. Share this video with someone who may have forgotten, but is now ready to remember. Because these courts still stand, these gods still speak, these stories still matter. May your life be a testimony carved not just in words, but in balance, justice, and sacred truth. Go now, not with fear, but with reverence, knowing that one day when your soul returns to the circle, the divine ones will rise, not to judge you with fire, but to welcome you with light. The courtroom is open. Walk well. Speak truth. And remember,